Good evening from our headquarters in Kyiv. This is the new season of the Sunday show at Hromadske International, the only prime-time television discussion explaining Eastern European geopolitical storm in English. I'm Natalia Humenyuk, and this fall we are going to present you a bit updated format with just top guests, top stories, and only updated discussion on what's really happening. And we are very happy to have our first guest, Mike McFaul, who is a former ambassador to Russia of the United States and currently a professor at Stanford University, and as well the person who has his personal issues with the Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Well, that's
Mike.
true, but thanks for having me back. Glad to be back here.
Mike, so we try and also to have a bit informal conversation, so really we give some feeling of what's going on. So you are in Kyiv now. There is a big event, the conference, where a lot of politicians coming. But what is interesting, I understand for you it's an opportunity, and for us, you meet a lot of people. You meet your colleague who is currently working in Russia, ambassador of the US in Russia. You talk to the Ukrainian politician. I don't know to what extent with the leaders of the state, young politicians. Yeah. And for instance, I know you're in touch with Sviatoslav Vakarchuk, who is our new Bono. Bono is also here in Kyiv at this moment when we are sitting.
They were there together today just now, yes.
Oh yeah, so what would be your major take on what's going on in the Ukrainian politics and also on everything related to the Ukrainian politics in the global context?
So to start at 30,000 feet, I frequently have this experience, and most certainly in this few days that I've been here, I have this emotional feeling very strongly, which is to say that when you sit in Palo Alto, or you sit in the United States and you read about Ukraine, the news is usually pretty negative, let's be honest. There's a lot of focus on corruption. There's a lot of focus on the reforms that have slowed down, the difficult negotiations with the IMF, obviously the tragic war in Donbass. That seems like the negotiations there are not making much progress. Mr. Volker is here, Ambassador Volker is here. That's the impression you get, you read from afar, and it's a pretty negative story. Every time I come to Ukraine, and I come about twice a year, I always come here and the energy and hope always seems, I always leave with more hope than when I arrive. And that most certainly has been the case for the last 3 days, because you have, at least from a comparative perspective, right? And now I want to put on my professor hat. As somebody who looks at lots of countries around the world and struggles with democracy, struggles with market reform, that's my area of specialization. What is striking about Ukrainian society is two things. One, the depth of civil society, and by that I also mean independent media, altogether, right? There's an energy here that you don't see in other countries, especially countries farther to your east, number one. And two, on the political side, sometimes your politics are pretty rough and tough. I've heard some negative things about each, different politicians, and criticism of the parties not doing enough and presidential candidates. But what's interesting to me, just looking at it comparatively, is it's a lively, competitive process. Competition is the key to democracy. No competition, no democracy. And here's a very important point. Do you know who's going to be the president of Ukraine next summer?
I really have no idea.
That means there's democracy. If you, when
it could be, in fact, at least what I can believe, there would be three persons who definitely have chances. Like, it's not even two.
Right, but the fact that it's three...
Might be more. I can consider even four.
Okay.
Myself, like seriously.
But in my academic world, I've been in the political world, so I'm going to bounce back and forth between academia and politics, right? So in the political definition of democracy, there's a minimal definition that we use. One is before the election, whether it's prime minister or presidential, parliamentary or presidential, that the rules are known and they don't change, right? So somebody doesn't manipulate the rules of the game. That seems like that's pretty clear here, that nobody's trying to change the rules of the presidential election ahead of time. Two, uncertainty. that on election day or during the campaign, there's some uncertainty about who wins elections. Now, in some democracies, there's more or less, there's some uncertainty. And that feels this way. I've just listened to three, maybe four presidential candidates speak in the last 2 days. And the strong impression I get, and you just confirmed it, is that nobody knows who will win the first round and nobody knows who will win the second round. That's a good thing. And then the third key condition is that after there's been an election, that there's not somebody that comes in and says, oh, well, that didn't matter. We're now going to have the military decide, or we're going to have Allah decide, as you might see in a theocracy. And those conditions, I think, are present, and that gives me hope about the future of Ukrainian democracy.
But with everybody I talked at the YES conference and all the foreign guests here, analysts, former politicians, current politicians, they really ask. The only question they ask now, it's not really about the war, about Crimea, even not that much about reform, but about the presidential elections.
Yes.
And like with one clear question, who will win?
Yes.
But really, do you think that like this old guard, like Poroshenko and Tymoshenko, is it exactly repeating the same path? And are you encouraging anybody new to run, or encouraging youngsters to run?
Well, let me say a few things. First of all, I want to be very, very clear that I do not support any presidential candidate. I don't support any political party. I don't want to interfere in the domestic affairs of Ukraine. So that's point number one. Point number two, do I encourage young people in Ukraine to get involved in politics? Absolutely. As you know, because you're an alum of our program, we have been running a leadership program at Stanford for 15 years now. It's the 15th year of YES. I think this will be the 15th year of Draper Hill's program. You're an alumnus of that program. And in that program, we do lots of things, as you know, but one of the things, the messages we communicate is that it's sometimes important for those involved and active in civil society to become more directly involved in politics. So as a general message, I think that's a good idea. Not necessarily journalists, by the way.
Yeah, we have at least 4 journalists who've been at your program and are now in the parliament or working for the government.
That's right. That's right. Now that you reminded me, yes. So there were some journalists who decided to come. But the independent media has a separate, very important role in democracy. So I don't pressure journalists to do that. But then the third thing I would just say about the transitional thing that you said. I'm more focused on competition and less focused on the generational change or not. As long as there's a competitive process that give Ukrainian voters a clear choice, then we should just leave it to the voters. And if they choose, to vote in the old guard, well, that means that the old guard has made the argument that they should be voted in. And at the same time, I'm encouraged that there are new political forces and, new candidates that are thinking of running. That's a healthy process in a democratic society.
One another, really Ukrainian topic, not just, of course, Ukrainian, it's about the war in the East. If you had a chance really to follow what Ambassador Walker was talking, and honestly, knowing what's going on with Russian position, I hear more and more that, especially because of the elections in Ukraine, it's very hard to wait for any kind of deal or peacekeeping operation because we're coming to one cycle, meaning the present elections in April, and then they would be still waiting for the parliament. So it's like for a year, we don't really expect anything. Have you heard that? Was it discussed?
Yeah, I've heard that.
And really, what do you think also about the Russian stance? Are they really these ones who are waiting till the elections and then they would talk to who is the winner?
I think Vladimir Putin's going to wait for a long, long time. Okay. I'm pessimistic about chances for breakthrough. And I've heard it over the years now. There's always an election that we have to wait for. So first there was the American election. First there was the Russian election. And then I heard once President Putin wins, he's going to want to have a breakthrough on Minsk before 2018, before the summer, before the World Cup. And that turned out to be a complete illusion.
And before we waited for the Trump election and later
then
for
the
election in
Trump
France
election.
and Germany.
Yes, and so there's always going to be another election. I just don't see the argument yet for how Putin is going to leave his position. And therefore, I mean, of course people should try. And I am a supporter of what Ambassador Volker is trying to do. Of course, new ideas should be presented. And I think it is a creative idea to think about bringing in a United Nations peacekeeping force. What President Poroshenko said yesterday, I think is very rational. I just don't understand why Putin is going to sign up to these ideas. So I'm rather pessimistic about a breakthrough there.
Paul Manafort, a person important to this country, who's
Yes.
been for really let's count up almost to 10 years here,
Yes.
working for our former President Yanukovych, later who joined the campaign of current President Trump. He pled guilty and he kind of agreed to cooperate with the investigation of Mueller. What does it mean? And how we also see that things, a lot of people were hoping for a year that it would happen, and it's there.
Yes.
So what are expectations? What can we know?
Well, it's a good question, and most of what we will eventually know, we'll have to wait for Mr. Mueller's report, right? So, just generally speaking, I worked in the government for 5 years. I was 3 years at the White House and then 2 years in Moscow. I worked with Bob Mueller. He was the head of the FBI when I was there. By the way, he was also a Stanford visiting fellow. So you and Mr. Mueller have something in common, just so you know. Because after he retired from the FBI, he came and spent some time with us. And the one thing I always was struck by in the government is when I would see about press reports of what was going on with some negotiation, it was always just a little piece of it. Even the best journalists would only know a little piece of it. And I have that strong feeling with respect to Mr. Mueller's work. I think we just know a little bit of what he's doing. So that's the first point. Second point, I think it's a big thing that Mr. Manafort decided to plead guilty because the expectation was always he was going to hold out, he was going to be loyal to President Trump.
Even people were discussing if Trump would pardon him.
And then that was considered the quid pro quo. So this feels like we're in new territory. And so that's a new development that I don't think is good for the president. There are also some things about Ukraine and our society as well in the indictment, including what looks to be a very vigorous smear campaign against Yulia Tymoshenko that Mr. Manafort apparently was involved in for several years, including with the Obama administration, lobbying us to say certain things about her anti-Semitic ideas, her pro-Russian ideas. I don't know exactly, I haven't read the whole indictment. Clearly these things were not true, but it shows you the lengths to which the Yanukovych government was deploying resources to try to portray Yulia Tymoshenko in an unflattering way.
What we're in particularly interested, because probably there was no person of that level, or maybe you would correct me, who pled guilty and who is so deeply connected to very corrupt circles here in Ukraine and also in Russia.
Yes.
So there where probably would be the way to know how it's working, because usually just what the investigative journalists are searching. So really, what do you think, symbolically also, what it mean, how people in Russia would think? So we need to ask them, but what do you think? Would it make people there worried?
Well, one thing I want to say is it's also a victory for transparency and independent journalists and independent parliamentarians. Ukraine played a role in exposing some of this corruption, and I think we should congratulate the Ukrainians, your media and your Rada for helping to do that. I, as an American citizen, am thankful that work took place here in Ukraine. Second thing, without question, Mr. Manafort has had a long-standing set of very complicated relationships with many people in Ukraine and also Russia. We already know that. Some of these are people I know from my work in the government. What I don't know is, did his complicated, and now we know sometimes illegal interactions with business people in Ukraine and Russia also were involved with the Trump organization and President Trump. We don't know that yet. And I want to be very clear about that. We should not jump, we don't get ahead of our skis, is a phrase we use in English. When you're skiing, if you lean too far, then you fall. Let's not get ahead of our skis yet to jump to conclusions. But for me, it's always been the case that the most interesting part of what Mr. Mueller is doing is following the money. I've always said that. That to me will be, and whether it leads to a dead end or not, but I think that part of his investigation is the most important.
I would like myself to share also the thoughts which I hear with the investigators who are dealing with a lot of cases connected to former President Yanukovych and Manafort involved.
Okay.
Also, there is an urge, I wonder that the people in DC also need to know that Manafort is a very important witness to cases of the murder of the people here at the Maidan, on everything, because there is an investigation of our former president. And of course, Ukraine always considered like a smaller country, but because of this connection, it's also very critical to Ukrainian prosecutors, especially dealing with a serious crime, to get to know the information, because it's their unique chance also to ask on probably one of the most horrible events in the recent history of modern Ukraine.
That's a great observation, of course. That makes perfect sense.
I know they're trying, but it's not really easy to get that. But I think like the official kind of request is there.
Has already gone in.
And then
through Interpol or directly to the U.S.
I think
government?
Directly, because of different ways of cooperation.
Okay.
It's not really going kind of really efficiently so far. I can
see.
tell it on the record, because that's kind of was also mentioned.
Well, maybe this will add new impetus for it, though.
Yeah, because it was like mentioned on our broadcast that they're really looking forward for that.
Interesting.
While this week we also followed a very interesting case of the two Russian guys, I don't know even how to call them, who are accused of the poisoning and alleged suspect on the murder, not murder, poisoning of Skripal. You see these guys, Petrov and Pasharov, who had given a very strange interview to RT channel, Margarita Simonian, as if they traveled to Salisbury in being a tourist. The story doesn't make it together. It's pretty awkward. What are your thoughts? Why they would need to come? After that, there were many journalists who confirmed they have the passport numbers, which is really almost identical. The numbers of some of the data is connected to the Ministry of, it could be some of the law enforcement and military personnel in Russia. And, the whole situation, especially this interview, it's pretty odd for everybody.
Yes.
Nobody understands why they've been shown. Is it kind of a new way of theater in these relations? And what do you really think about also this case?
Well, it's extremely strange to me. I honestly do not understand what President Putin was trying to prove when he said on the record, we found them and you should interview them, and then they were interviewed. It was a very strange interview. It did nothing in my mind to create any kind of case in support of their defense. Their alibis seem very strange. You're going to go to the weekend to England, and you're going to stay in London and go to Salisbury twice. It's very, very odd, and I honestly don't understand it. What I do understand about Mr. Putin is two things. That number one, he has become increasingly defiant of the international system, of the sovereignty of other countries, your country, my country, and now the United Kingdom. Remember, all of these are violations of our sovereignty. What they did in our election in 2016, obviously more tragically what they've done to your country, but now here's another case as well. And I think these are illegal actions. violating some of the basic norms of the international system. And I see him increasingly flippant, daring us to try to do something. So we need to learn more about these two gentlemen and what was going on. But in some ways, I just see Putin saying, okay, I dare you to do something against me. And I hope we do. I hope at least my country will, we've already imposed some sanctions with regard to this case. By law, the Trump administration is to increase those sanctions, coming up pretty soon, by the way, and I hope we will do that.
And Michael, what is happening to your case after this demand of the Russian officials to question you?
Yeah.
There was a firm answer of the State Department, not that firm from the President Trump, but that was right after the Helsinki summit.
Yeah.
And already a couple of months. So any news? Anybody approached you? How it's working?
Well, it's another case.
What are you expecting?
Yeah,
what could be done still at this stage?
So, to remind your viewers, at the Helsinki summit, President Trump and President Putin met one-on-one for a couple of hours. I personally thought that was a bad idea. I used to be the note taker for President Obama in his summits, and I think it's a good idea to have experts around, by the way, and it's a good idea to have somebody taking notes because all presidents, American presidents, have to deal with all kinds of issues that it's impossible for them to keep up on. That's why we have staff. And I many times would write a note to President Obama about something that was happening in his meeting with Putin or Medvedev to try to help him understand what was going on. So in Helsinki, I'm also a journalist now, a commentator. I work for NBC News in America. And so I was in Helsinki as part of our team covering the summit. And remember, 3 days before, Mr. Mueller had indicted a dozen GRU intelligence officers with a very detailed indictment. By the way, for people who underestimate our intelligence community, that was a great piece of intelligence work, and I hope many Russians read that closely. If we can do that with those gentlemen, we can do that with a lot of other people. That should be a warning to people about how good our intelligence services are. Sorry for the side advertisement for the CIA, but they're really good. But Putin came to that meeting, and for me, it was classic Putin. He's somebody I've known for a long time. It's whataboutism, right? Moral equivalency for things that have nothing to do. So the way I understand it is he went into that meeting with President Trump and he said, well, you have 11 people that you think have broken your laws. Here's our list. And I was on the list of people that we think have broken Russian law. And I want to make one thing clear. Usually people think that it's because of the old crime that I committed, which was to foment revolution against Putin. That's frequently in the Russian propaganda. This was a new one. This was about my work at the White House. As the general prosecutor spokesperson made clear, in 2009, 2010, I was coordinating our policy towards the wrongful death of Sergei Magnitsky, and that allegedly is my crime. And unfortunately, President Trump said, I think it's a great idea to have these people interrogated. At the time, I gave the president the benefit of the doubt. I said he probably doesn't understand what Putin's doing. It was clear as day to me what he was doing. But over time, they kept, as you rightly pointed out, they kept entertaining the idea. Thankfully, we have a democracy, and it's alive and well. And the U.S. Congress stepped in, the U.S. Senate stepped in, and voted 98-0 to condemn this idea. And once that happened, then the administration changed their views and said they're not going to hand us over. By the way, they couldn't hand us over either because we have a constitution. I have my constitutional rights. Little side note that even if President Trump wanted to hand us over, and I want to be clear, it wasn't just me, it was Democrats and Republicans that were on the list. My next problem, the reason I brought up Interpol, is what I've learned over the course of this situation for me to be suggested that I might have committed some crime against Russia, although it's very abstract, means that they can use systems like Interpol to seek to stop me in third countries. And so my strategy moving forward is to try to make that virtually impossible. But I've learned that they've done it against Ukrainians, they've done it against Russians, where they abuse the Interpol system to try to detain people that they don't like for political purposes.
A lot of your views will use an opportunity to promote your book.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, the New York Times bestseller for some time. Yeah,
yes.
From Cold War to Hot Peace, where the last chapter is really about the Putin and Trump.
Yes.
While my last question would be on a different book. You know, like this book should be read, but the question would be on the other.
And hopefully it'll soon be in Ukrainian.
I'm
working
translated.
on that.
I talked to the publisher,
Great.
asked, how are you? She said, like, we're translating Mike's book,
Fantastic.
so it's there.
That's great news.
And recently there was a talk about a different book by Bob Woodward about the President Trump, with all the naughty things about him, and also at the same time there was an op-ed in New York Times Anonymous about like the civil servant who's speaking, the insider of the White House, speaking also about the craziness of President Trump.
Yes.
And really, how unique is that? What does it mean? How serious is that? How we can understand that being here in Ukraine, being here in Eastern Europe, of that kind of things, which are also largely talked now.
You know, I think it's unprecedented. I can't remember a time when we had this kind of an op-ed like that. That would have been unthinkable in the Obama administration. I think it is a testimony to how chaotic things are in the Trump administration. I have many friends that work in the Trump administration, some at some very senior levels. I have some friends who have already left the Trump administration, and anecdotally, what I've heard about the process confirms what you heard in the Woodward book and in that anonymous op-ed. Having said that, I'm not a big fan of that anonymous op-ed, by the way. I don't respect that. I think whoever that person was either should work loyally to the president, or two, put their name on the op-ed, or three, resign. I think they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to tell the world, we grown-ups, we're doing all this great work, and you're not giving us credit for the great work that we're doing. And I appreciate the quote-unquote grown-ups that are working for my country. And I want to remind your listeners, your viewers, that I went in and took an oath of office on January 21st, 2009. I remember the day very vividly. President Obama was there, and he brought all of us new staffers, and we put our hands up and we took an oath. But we didn't take an oath to Barack Obama. We took an oath to the United States of America. And I respect people. I would never work for President Trump, but I respect, and some people I even consulted with, to go in and work for them. But you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say, I'm doing all this good work, pat me on the back, but then you got to take credit, you have to take responsibility for the bad things that are happening too. So you can't just be the grown-up from 12 to 6 and then say, well, the grown-ups weren't around from 6 to 10. You have to own the good stuff and the bad stuff.
Mike, thanks a lot
Thanks
for a very exciting conversation and a lot of insights.
Great.
Yeah, great to have you here. Hope you'll be back. So thanks a lot for being with us. And that was the Sunday show at Hromadske International, and see you in a week. And follow us on all our social network, Twitter, Facebook, search Hromadske International. Go to our weekly update of our newsletter. You can find it on our webpage, en.hromadske.ua. So stay tuned, and we are here to explain Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Goodbye.